Good morning. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of Nation and Proletariat, Reimagining the Russian Empire in Fedor Reshetnikov's ethnographic fictions. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, podcasts, and other publications. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for its generous support of several of the Kennan Institute's fellowships. These fellowships allow us to support rising scholars, such as today's guest, Dr. Helen Stuhr-Rommereim. Dr. Helen Stuhr-Rommereim is a visiting assistant professor of Russian at Swarthmore College. Her research examines social history, political theory, Russia's revolutionary social movements, cultural representation, and more broadly, the history of Russian and Russophone literature. Helen has completed her first book, which is entitled Democratizing Writing, Representation as Fiction and Politics in Reform-Era Russia. After our guest speaks, there will be a question and answer period. For our online audience, if you'd like to ask a question, you may submit your question in one of three ways: via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or via Facebook. And please remember to include your name and affiliation when submitting your question. Helen, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's nice to be back here at the Kennan Institute and to have a chance to share some of the fruits of my labors when I was here on my fellowship a little bit ago. So I'm going to begin my talk today by introducing you to a literary character who is importantly linked to the life and work of Fedor Reshetnikov, the writer who I'm focusing on my talk today. And this character comes from a work that is much more famous than anything that Reshetnikov wrote. It is Nikolai Nekrasov's epic poem, Who Lives Well in Rus? Кому на Руси жить хорошо, which was written between 1866 and 1877. This is a masterpiece of realist poetry. But I'm starting here because the relationship between the real author Reshetnikov and the fictionalized, mythologized version of him that we find in Nekrasov's epic sets up a contrast between different ways that the collective population of the Russian Empire was imagined in literature in the wake of the emancipation of the serfs. That is what I want to talk about today. So this is Grisha Dobrosklonov. This character appears in the conclusion to Who Lives Well in Rus. As a whole, the poem narrates a group of peasants' search for those residents of the Russian Empire who are living well, as the title suggests, mostly to no avail. Nobody is really living well, as it turns out. And when we meet Dobrosklonov, he is also not living very well. We're told of his impoverished upbringing as the son of a poor country deacon. But in the case of Dobrosklonov, his bitter memories serve a purpose in the poem. They give rise to a revolutionary conviction. And ultimately, Grisha offers a vision for a better life that would be shared by peasant and non-peasant alike, as he delivers this song of spiritual healing through shared national being that's inspired by the sight of toiling barge haulers on the Volga River. So his poem goes, "You are wretched, you are bountiful, you are downtrodden, you are all-powerful, Mother Rus." And you might recognize this image of toiling barge haulers that represent the collective power of the common people from Ilya Repin's painting. This is one of the most famous works of Russian realist painting, and it was completed a few years before Nekrasov's poem. But there are other precedents for Dobrosklonnov's significant encounter with barge haulers. One, Nekrasov himself wrote a poem about a barge hauler 20 years earlier in 1854, and this helped establish this figure in kind of the pantheon of populist rhetoric about the strength of the people. And about 10 years after Nekrasov published his first barge hauler poem in 1864, the young writer, Fedor Reshetnikov, wrote to Nekrasov, who was at the time the publisher and editor of the most important journal in the radical intellectual sphere. This was Современник, or the Contemporary. And he promised Nekrasov a new view of the barge hauler that was based on his own experience growing up on the Kama River, which feeds into the Volga.
I'm sorry.
That's right. So Reshetnikov wrote to Nekrasov, "I know the lives of these poor people well, because I lived in Cherdyn district and I spent 20 years on the banks of the Kama, along which in spring thousands of barges and tens of thousands of barge haulers would float by, and I thought to write about their lives with the hopes of in some way helping these poor laborers." And the work that resulted from these observations was Reshetnikov's breakthrough publication, the novella Podlipovci. Podlipovci just means people who live in Podlipovka. So there's no real translation of that title. It was published in Nekrasov's journal, The Contemporary, that same year in 1864, and Reshetnikov dedicated this work to Nekrasov. But part of what made Reshetnikov's depiction of the barge haulers important and interesting to Nekrasov is exactly what he outlines in this letter, that he, unlike Nekrasov himself, is writing from experience, from direct, intimate observation. So this is a difference between authorial perspective. That's something that I want to focus on in my talk today. And this wasn't just a story Reshetnikov was telling strategically, although it was also a story he was telling strategically. But he really was a writer from a very different background than Nekrasov, and he lived a different kind of life. He was a self-educated orphan from Perm province. He learned to write from studying addresses on the envelopes that his postman uncle delivered, and he never attended university. He died quite young at 29 in 1871 from complications from tuberculosis, like many writers of similar backgrounds. While Nekrasov was a nobleman, and by 1864 a very successful businessman and a celebrated poet. So these distinct social positions that they each occupied shaped how they depicted their barge haulers and other subjects from the common people, but they also had a real professional relationship. So Nekrasov helped Reshetnikov build a literary career during his short life, and after his death, he transformed him into a literary character. So another decade after the publication of Podlipovci in 1876, Reshetnikov's first letter to Nekrasov would be echoed in the experience of the character Grisha Dobrosklonov as he walks along the Volga. So Nekrasov writes, "Grigory walked, looking over at the satisfied barge hauler. And from his lips, words burst forth, first whispering, then loud." And this is the poem Burlak, or Barge Hauler, which brings Grisha to the moment of inspiration that leads to his final glorious song, Rus, which I quoted a little bit ago. And Nekrasov writes, "From the barge hauler, Grisha's thoughts moved to all of great mysterious Rus, to the people." So from Nekrasov to Reshetnikov to Repin and back to Nekrasov, the figure of the barge hauler is variously relates an intelligentsia readership to the common people. Nekrasov's original 1854 poem functions to define the barge hauler as a type in the naturalist mode, while Reshetnikov's Podlipovci instead tells the story of how ethnic Komi peasants from Perm province become barge haulers. So it gives insight into their backstories and origins. In Dobrosklonov's poem and in Repin's painting, the labor of the barge haulers is transformed into a symbolic vector for conjuring broader civic belonging. The barge haulers represent the suffering and strength of the people, or narod, generally. They become symbolic of the Russian people as an idea, not particular Komi peasants who leave home, as in Reshetnikov's narrative. But in Nekrasov's poem, it's not only the barge haulers who come to symbolize national collectivity, it's also Dobrosklonov himself. And Dobrosklonov is a character who is constructed, as I've started to suggest, out of the details of the lives of real writers whose careers Nekrasov cultivated in the 1860s. Not only Reshetnikov, also the radical critic Nikolai Dobrolyubov, whose name is recalled by the name Dobrosklonov, and Nikolai Pamilovsky, who shared Dobrosklonov's upbringing, and also Reshetnikov, who, thanks to Podlipovci, was really strongly associated with those same barge haulers that inspire Dobrosklonov's song. And these writers, here on the slide, built careers in the radical literary press, and they were celebrated as mediators like the fictional Dobrosklonov between the people and the intellectuals. And this collective of writers are the subject of the larger book projects that this talk comes out of, which I could discuss. But the The point I want to make here is that Nekrasov used these writers' legacy to do something that they weren't doing themselves. The image of Dobrasklonov is a means of accessing the barge hauler as a symbol of national collectivity to which a reader, probably from the nobility, can feel as connected as anyone else. Reshetnikov instead connected the barge hauler to a material struggle that he shared in himself and from which his readership was mostly excluded, and that was the experience of proletarianization. In fact, the narrative of proletarianization that Reshetnikov connects to the barge hauler was his primary literary subject, and he wrote about it in a variety of contexts. This is one example. This is a scene from Reshetnikov's long novel, Where Is It Better? This was published in 1868, and here he depicts the social and natural upheaval of the railroad construction. So he writes, crowds of people, more and more, arrive from different places onto the road, walking to the railroad. The fields seemed forgotten. In the villages, you could only see children, the dying, the blind, and old sickly people, and maybe some gaunt livestock. There was less and less forest around the road, and where there used to be a field, the land was all dug up a few feet inside. So strikingly, in this passage, Reshetnikov emphasizes the social and physical destruction of agrarian life. And in 1868, this might have been a little bit of an exaggeration. Of course, there were still lots of peasants working and living as farmers at this time. But that doesn't really lessen the impact of such a depiction, which suggested that the traditional life world of the Russian peasantry no longer existed or would soon no longer exist. And this was essentially the worst fear of all of the elites, no matter their political persuasion, liberal, Slavophile, populist. The total immiseration of the peasantry was a moral blight and a political threat, depending on how you were thinking about it. And in Reshetnikov's work from the 1860s, that immiseration appears as though it can't be prevented because it's already happened. So the proletariat that we find him describing presents a notion of collectivity that's material rather than spiritual or national, and thus begs material change. For community across classes, a sense of fellow feeling derived from literature won't do anything real. Society instead has to be remade. And this is a big difference between Nekrasov's collective of Rus and Reshetnikov's collective of the proletariat. And I'll turn now to talking about Reshetnikov's work in a little more detail. And I want to look especially at how this contrast between Reshetnikov and Nekrasov represents, at the contrast between how Reshetnikov and Nekrasov represent collectivity across classes and how it relates to another set of social questions of the mid-19th century, those pertaining to the place of ethnic minorities within the Russian imperial polity. So the issue of peasant integration and of how to manage national minority populations were more closely linked than it often appears in the literature of the time in the 1860s, which tends to figure the people in the sense of the common people as by default Russian. In reality, the so-called common people, the poor people of the Russian Empire, were incredibly ethnically diverse. But this elision is in the word for the people itself, narod or narodnost, meaning both national and popular, Russian and common. Dobrasklonnov's Rus highlights the complexity of this notion of narod. His vision of Rus is rooted in the strength and suffering of the people, broadly construed. And this is really a civic notion of nationality that Nekrasov is developing. But nonetheless, it's through shared belonging to Rus that the implied intelligentsia reader is able to imagine themselves sharing a political community with the barge hauler. So this civic nationality is still tied to a notion of Russianness. And the Reshetnikov's work unsettles the image of an imperial population that's united by Mother Rus. It's the experience of proletarianization, of being uprooted from traditional life, that unites the common people in the Reshetnikov's work. There's no traditional narodny life for anyone here. And it's also worth noting that there's no traditional family life either. Reshetnikov's proletarian workers are women as often as they are men, and this is also reflected in his own experience. His wife worked as a midwife, and he had a lot of familiarity with women's labor. But as we dig deeper in Reshetnikov's ethnographic fictions, we'll also see that this image that he renders of the proletariat can overcome only certain ethnic and confessional boundaries between Russian workers and Komi peasants, between Old Believers and Standard Orthodoxy, but not in Reshetnikov's works between Russians and Jews. So I want to show today how in his work we find both really a remarkable effort to reimagine the imperial polity and confront limitations around a notion of class belonging that doesn't consider national and ethnic difference. So returning to Reshetnikov's proletarianization plot, this is a story of uprooting and upheaval in which there's no image of traditional agrarian peasant life to be found. And it's one that Reshetnikov would tell again and again. So in Padlipovci, we have Komi peasants who leave their home village to work on the barges. There's a short story, Yashka. This is a long short story about a baby born in St. Petersburg to a mother and father who have left the village. And the story details basically the slow destruction of their family through work and material need. And then the long novel, Where Is It Better, from also 1868. This is about a group of peasants from a Ural factory settlement who are Old Believers. They go looking for someplace better, as the title suggests. They're dispersed and propelled across Russia, and eventually they all end up in St. Petersburg. There are other examples, but these are a few important ones. And each of these plots is driven by the struggle to survive, which sends protagonists on journeys that integrate diverse spheres of life in the Russian Empire and separate them from their homes and their family members. So this plot of dispersion also develops a new collective that's shaped by this process of dispersion. This dispersion across the empire also kind of sews together the imperial geography. And this emerging proletariat that appears in Reshetnikov's work was a collective that the author himself also belonged to, as I've said, but from which his readership, the mostly noble intelligentsia at the time, were excluded. So this dynamic was conditioned by the particular authorial position that Reshetnikov occupied, by both his understanding of himself as an author and his method of writing. But Reshetnikov put his authorial identity, his way of framing himself in his own terms, and I think an especially vivid way in this letter. This is written when he was only 19. He was just dreaming about becoming a writer, and he was writing to his uncle. And he writes, "No one sees the poor man, but he, from an unseen vantage, sees everything in the world. The poor man in the crowd of the human world lives like a judge over it, although it doesn't know him." And I think this perspective of the poor man in the crowd of the human world effectively describes Reshetnikov's way of understanding himself as a writer, and it also describes his research method as it would take shape. He presented himself as a writer whose access to the authentic experiences of the poor people of the Russian Empire was rooted in his ability to disappear among them. In other words, in the fact that he was one of them. And his archive is full of notes documenting eavesdropped conversations in taverns and the details of his neighbors' finances and personal lives. So he was just gathering information, and then he'd incorporate it into his stories. And to give a little bit more context for how this was part of a distinctive authorial paradigm in Russian literature at the time, I'll just briefly compare the authorial identity that Reshetnikov articulates for himself to that of Lev Tolstoy, realist master. Andrew Wachtel describes the way that Tolstoy developed his authorial identity through his pseudo-autobiographical trilogy, Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth. And Wachtel argues that the exquisite childhood that we find in Tolstoy's autobiographically based novellas comes to be accepted as a shared Russian virtue that helped justify the continued cultural prominence of the nobility in the 1850s and 1860s. And Reshetnikov and the other non-noble writers of his generation also wrote about themselves in ways that articulated the significance of people from their specific background for Russian culture generally. But Reshetnikov and his fellow poor working writers occupied a different authorial paradigm from that of Tolstoy's omniscient narrator, which he's beginning to define in Childhood. So Wachtel writes that in childhood, noble childhood is conveyed as an ideal of childhood that could belong to anyone, and this is connected to the capacity to tell a universal story. Where stories by Reshetnikov, based on his identification with those he writes about, develop a narrative voice that's objective, that's capable of witnessing diverse spheres of national life, but that's not universal. It's a situated rather than omniscient view, and the experiences he narrates don't appear as though they could belong to anyone. And we see this in this passage from Podlipovci. Here the protagonists of the novella Pila and Sisoyko wake up in jail after spending an evening in the taverns in the city where they have come for the first time. They fall asleep in the middle of the street, and the reader shares their confusion as they wake up and figure out what's going on. Pila and Sisoyko couldn't understand where they were and what sort of people were there. Did they remember that they had been in the tavern and how they ended up there? They were afraid. Were they already in that other world? Was this already barge hauling? So Reshetnikov keeps his reader's view attached really closely to that of his characters, sort of figuring things out as they do. And as Reshetnikov's authorial persona, within and outside of his writing, is based on identification with his subjects. And this authorial paradigm based on identity then poses a question about the limits of this identification. And Reshetnikov pushed the limits of this type of authorial paradigm more than other writers who occupied a similar position in the literary culture of his time. Those other writers whose biographical facts are incorporated into Dobrasklonov, because in his work we find a more diverse representation of the impoverished people of the empire. We have Komi peasants in Perm, workers in St. Petersburg, and Jews in the Pale. But his relationship with his subjects accordingly shifted depending on the context where he was working. So when he wrote about ethnic Komi peasants in Perm, he was their representative to the intellectual world of the capital, even though he wasn't Komi himself. When he wrote about urban workers, he wrote about experiences that he shared as a poor provincial who moved to the city. And when he wrote about Jews in the Pale, he wasn't anymore a poor man in the crowd, rather he was really a representative of the center of power itself, so he couldn't write in the same way. So I'll turn now to Reshetnikov's Jewish sketches to see what changes when he begins writing about this milieu. Reshetnikov moved with his wife and daughter to Brest-Litovsk on the border of what they called then the interior provinces and the Kingdom of Poland, which was also part of the Russian Empire. They moved from St. Petersburg in 1867. Brest was a military city with a large Russian fortress, and he moved there with his wife when she was assigned to work as a midwife in the military hospital. So Reshetnikov took on the project of writing about the Jews in Brest as essentially the only other civilians around. And his notes suggest that he was approaching his studies of Jewish people in the Pale in search of the same story that he was telling in his other works. He was looking for the story of proletarianization. The first sketch that he wrote, called Overnight in a Jewish City, he wrote it on his way there, and he observes that poor Jews are driven, quote, to leave to Warsaw or St. Petersburg or to disperse across Russia. So he's already identifying this phenomenon that he's interested in elsewhere, despite the complexities of moving around the empire for Jews who were confined to the Pale. And in his sketch, The Work and Rest Days of Yanko Dvorkin and His Family, which is the most substantial work representing Jews that he completed, he focuses on the most downtrodden member of the society he's writing about, a servant in the Dvorkin family named Leah. So Leah is his proletarian heroine in this story. But when Leah is about to leave the Dvorkins and begin this proletarian struggle that he writes about elsewhere, she instead commits suicide, effectively cutting her narrative of proletarianization short. So why does this happen? According to his own account, Reshetnikov couldn't find a way into writing about Jewish society. He couldn't occupy the position of the invisible poor man in the crowd that he occupied elsewhere. He wrote in his journal, "I cannot write about the Jews from a firm perspective because I see only the external." And this struggle to find an internal perspective appears in other sections of his diary and other sketches that he wrote. In Brest-Litovsk, among the Jews, Reshetnikov was not just an outsider, but he was a representative of the imperial center. In something like an inversion of the typical relationship between an authoritative ethnographer and the other that they observe and define, Reshetnikov's proximity to power in Brest, combined with his particular understanding of himself as an author, made it impossible for him to write as he was used to. And as a result, his sketches come out as kind of a bad version of exoticizing ethnography. He made up for the information that he couldn't gather by collecting facts from questionable sources and inventing things. And he himself was unsatisfied with the results of his effort. Janko Dworkin, when it was published, drew criticism for its obvious inaccuracies about Jewish life. But it doesn't just suffer from factual inaccuracies. The very texture of the story is different from Reshetnikov's other works. The intimate narrating perspective that he establishes in Padlipovci is absent. He stays at a distance from his subjects. For instance, here, Janko traveled 3 days. In the villages and towns, there were many who were indebted to him. He threatened and frightened the poor so that they paid him in flour as much as he could gather. So here and elsewhere, all throughout the story, we get a view that's literally external, as Reshetnikov himself writes. We get no sense of Janko's experience, and his actions conform to the stereotypical image of the Jew who exploits innocent peasants. But this inability to access an internal narrating perspective, as Reshetnikov puts it, effectively cuts off the world of Janko from that of the proletariat that we find in other of Reshetnikov's works. And we actually see this most clearly in Leah's suicide, which really powerfully distinguishes her from others of Reshetnikov's heroes and heroines. So Leah's suicide has literary precedence, with particular significance for the radical literary milieu. It recalls the suicide of Katerina, the heroine of Alexander Ostrovsky's 1859 play The Storm, Groza. In the critic Nikolai Dobrolyubov's influential reading of that play, he highlights Katerina's suicide as a powerful act of individual will in protest to an unacceptable but inescapable social reality. And Reshetnikov would have been familiar with this essay, and Leah's suicide in Janko is clearly rendered as a similar act of protest. She can't go on and she can't escape. But this isn't the only moment of intertext with the storm in Reshetnikov's work from the same period. In Where Is It Better, which was also published in 1868, he explicitly contrasts the fate of his heroine, Perigeia Makhronosova, to that of Katerina. So after a long and arduous struggle at the end of this 400-page novel, Perigeia has finally found a stable living and working arrangement, and she celebrates by going to see Ostrovsky's play, The Storm. And after this, the moment when things have finally gotten better for her, she suddenly falls ill and dies, and the novel ends rather unceremoniously. But this unceremonious end is meaningful. Her death is a shock because, as a reader, we've seen her survive so many ordeals, but it's also absolutely unremarkable. It echoes many other unceremonious deaths that have occurred throughout the novel, and it's explicitly contrasted with the death of Katerina, which she witnesses on stage right before falling ill. Perigeia's death links her to her friends and family and many others who suffered a similar fate. It's part of the proletarian struggle. But Leah, like Katerina, asserts her individual will in protest to her conditions, which fundamentally separates her from this collective struggle that Reshetnikov articulates elsewhere. So it seems that Reshetnikov, because he cannot write about Leah's social world, the world of the Jews, from the internal perspective that he is able to occupy elsewhere, because of the position that he occupies in Brest, he deals with this narratively with Leah's suicide, which symbolically severs her world from the broader imperial society within which he shows elsewhere a proletarian collective taking shape. So, coming to my conclusions, we see that Reshetnikov's pan-Imperial proletariat has the capacity to cross ethnic lines in certain circumstances because it situates traditional peasant life as fundamentally in the past. While Nekrasov highlights the static image of the barge hauler as poetic inspiration, Reshetnikov is interested in the narrative of becoming a barge hauler. His characters are linked by their shared material struggle, by that becoming rather than a symbolic unity. And Reshetnikov's roaming masses reveal the image of common belonging to Rus that we find in Nekrasov's epic poem to be an illusory, rather compensatory response to social stratification. But Reshetnikov's alternative material notion of collectivity is reflected in the very authorial paradigm that he and his fellow writers from the people, so-called, occupied, which was likewise based on shared lived experience rather than shared nationality. But Reshetnikov's inability to write about the Jews from the same perspective leads him to particularize Leah's struggle and to exclude her from his emerging proletarian collective, effectively cutting the pale of settlement out of his view of a Russian empire that's sewn together by a proletariat on the move. By the same token, the way that the children of the Komi peasants that Reshetnikov writes about in Padlipovci eventually lose their attachment to their home, along with all markers of their ethnic difference, highlights how Reshetnikov's tales of proletarianization can also be read as tales of Russification. Becoming a proletarian is becoming modern, and in the Russian Empire, becoming modern means becoming Russian. So in Reshetnikov's ethnographic fictions, we can recognize, I think, a legitimate effort to seek out the experience of the common people outside of the confines of ethnic and confessional boundaries. But his failure, and he himself felt that his Jewish sketches were a failure, also sheds light on the limitations of a notion of class solidarity that doesn't consider national and ethnic difference in a polity structured by ethnic hierarchies. And this is a problem that would not be easily resolved for later revolutionary movements of the 19th or 20th centuries. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you for excellent, and the slides were beautiful as well. I want to open the floor to questions from, we've got both an in-person and an online audience. And as a reminder for the online audience, please submit your questions in one of three ways. You can do it by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook, and then they'll populate up here. So we've already got one question that's come in from our online audience. How does Reshetnikov's attitude to Jews, including narrative tone, compare to that of Leskov in Bishop's judgment, especially but also in The Sealed Angel? And that's from Olga Mirsin at Georgetown.
That is a great question that I can't give a detailed answer right now, but it's actually it's like the next part of this is to go back and read those Leskov stories and write, I think, more kind of concretely about the difference between his interpretation and Reshetnikov's. I don't want to, it's something I'm thinking about, but I don't have an answer, so I'm going to table it for now. It will be part of the written version of this project, that specific point. So thank you for that question. I'm sorry for the unsatisfying answer.
No, but you're addressing it, so that's great. Excellent. We've got another question that's come in. Why do Russian male writers like Tolstoy and Reshetnikov fall back on the trope of suicidal heroines? And that comes from Alex Pears-Reyes.
Well, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say in answer to this question is that I think that the thing that's striking about Leah's suicide in this story is that that's actually not the kind of story that generally Reshetnikov tells. I don't think, I mean, suicide has a whole set of kind of symbolic, conceptual attachments, and I think like the meaning of Anna Karenina's suicide is different perhaps than the meaning of Katerina's suicide. And in the case of this Ostrovsky play, there's a kind of double-layered issue of what Ostrovsky was doing and then what Dobralyubov interpreted, how Dobralyubov interpreted that play, because and Dobralyubov's interpretations were really influential. And so I think it makes sense in this case to think about Reshetnikov reading Ostrovsky's play through Dobrolyubov's interpretation, because he was part of this literary sphere, and because Dobrolyubov's interpretation was widely read and it was powerful. And Dobrolyubov interprets it allegorically as essentially Katerina is too good for this world. And what Ostrovsky shows is that in this milieu of the merchants and the limitations of her society, there's no future for her. And so the best thing that she can do, well, so she kills herself because she has no way of realizing a better life for herself. So he reads this as kind of, one, we have this wonderful heroine, and that's a good thing. We see that these kind of excellent people can exist and be imagined in literature, but unfortunately at this time we can't imagine a future for them in literature, and thus they commit suicide. That's Dobrolyubov's reading of Ostrovsky. I think, you know, Anna Karenina, Tolstoy, it's all doing something different, but in general, in Reshetnikov's stories, people, what is the kind of remarkable binding plot structure is just continuing to try to survive despite everything. So there's this really, I mean, harrowing depictions in some of these stories, like in this story Yashka that I mentioned, and one of the characters loses a hand and 3 of the fingers on her other hand. But she keeps going for a long time, finding various ways to survive. This is Yashka's mother. Right, so if you think about that in contrast, on the one hand, we have this character who's a working woman in St. Petersburg, completely impoverished. She loses her ability to work, and she still has a lot of narrative left for finding some way to survive. And that's the general type of Reshetnikov's heroes. So it's really striking that Leia has this story that goes in her just kind of, I can't go on, and then she goes and she kills herself. So some kind of answer to that question.
Excellent. Yeah, we have a question from the in-person audience.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gregor Finnegan, I'm also Georgetown. Yeah, so I guess I have 2 questions, and one is sort of following up on the previous one, which is, I was very struck by the 4 authors you showed at the beginning, who are all not only obviously like male and proletarian, but also of a certain age. And I think about Dobrolyubov, who also died young.
Yes.
And so it's like, it's very interesting that this sort of like, this Resnachenie spiritual kind of moment in the 1850s and 60s is like very, is so specific, and yet that figure is meant to stand in for the entire Russian population outside of the literary elite, basically. So how does the male, I guess, young male identity of all these writers like inflect the proletariat that they're trying to evoke? And then the other question is, I mean, it's striking me that he ends up in Brest-Litovsk right in the aftermath of the Polish uprising.
Yes.
And it's a moment where the Russian state is trying to sort of like stake its claim to the peasantry of the region as a way to kind of like pit them against the Jews and the Poles. So to what extent, I mean, I had kind of initially thought of this proletarianization as like a, you know, a radical vision, or at least like populist adjacent in some way, but this is clearly also potentially conservative in the sense of, you know, like, you know, we have to, and I mean, the whole figure of this guy like walking around, he's like collecting sacks of flour and like walking around with them. It's like, I mean, it's like this very weird sort of, I don't know, like it's something out of anti-Semitic propaganda, basically.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
So I'm just very interested in that kind of like the ideological aspect there.
Yes. So first with the young men writers. So there's a whole body of literature that I write about in another part of this project that's basically narratives by these writers that are about people like themselves who leave home, move to the capital, and become writers. And it's often part of this story that they, I mean, sometimes they don't survive to the end of the story, despite the commonalities between the authors and the heroes, and then their deaths are very similar to the ones that the authors themselves suffered, mostly tuberculosis, living in very cold apartments, drinking too much. So they kind of write themselves into the literature of that time as this character that that also captures the kind of writers that they are. So that's kind of my argument in that part of the story. But then it's really striking that after most of them are gone, Nekrasov, who was essentially he was their editor, he was kind of their boss. They wrote millions of letters to him begging for advances on stories that they were working on but just hadn't quite finished yet. Turns them into this character that kind of does a better job of fulfilling the role that they were all brought into literature to fulfill than they did themselves, because their work was a little bit too, it wasn't inspiring enough. So that's that kind of part of the narrative that that is in the background of this project about the larger group of writers. Then about the Polish uprising, and then the kind of conservatism of the proletarianization plot. I think that that's exactly what I'm trying to think about with looking at this material. So on the one hand, it's really clear from Reshetnikov's notes and from other sketches where he writes a little bit more from a first person, they're written more like as travel notes. So they're still fictionalized, but they're more like, this is my experience of coming to this place. And you see, one thing that he talks about is that there's no one here that's not wearing a uniform except for the Jews. So it's an extremely militarized space. And so he's incredibly out of place here and doesn't really know what to do, who to talk to. And he goes kind of looking to try and figure out, what's going on with the local population? And he has this description in one of his sketches of going to someone who works at the hotel where he's staying when he first arrives, and it just starts asking him all kinds of personal questions, which it seems like was what he would often do, where, how much money do you make? And how do you run your business? All these kinds of things. It didn't seem like he really wanted to talk to me, he says. But in this conversation, the guy he's talking to says, there's more and more Russian people coming. All of these young Russian people are coming here. And Reshetnikov says, I think it's because they're building the railroad. There's this whole conversation about this sense of the increased presence of imperial people, both military and otherwise, in this space that Reshetnikov is clearly part of himself, because the reason that he's sent there is that they need people to work in the military hospital, and that's why he ends up there. And so he's kind of finds himself in this place as an occupier, which he didn't necessarily, he didn't do that out of ideological commitment, or, it's kind of where fate brought him. But then in trying to write about the Jews, in the way that he writes about what he was doing himself, clearly he's trying to do it in the way that he was writing about other people in other places. But something that ends up being complicating here is that it's exactly part of the anti-Semitic stereotype that Jews exploit peasants, that they are capitalists. And so the people they're exploiting are those proletarians. And so the Jews end up being aligned with this kind of enemy class. And Leah, this is also part of her narrative, that she is trapped in Jewish society, and so she commits suicide. And so it does show this side of that narrative of proletarianization that that I think, it's powerful in Reshetnikov's work, because it's really remarkable. There's nothing like that in really anything else that I've read. He's writing about people who just don't show up in literature until he starts writing about them. I didn't know that there were factory peasants, who were serfs, factory serfs. Perhaps I should have known this, but as a literature scholar, I have never encountered factory serfs. It almost sounds like a contradiction. So you find, this, and the kind of collective that he's conjuring is this one in this description of the railroad, just people being kind of expelled from their homes en masse and emerging onto the road and all joining together and encountering each other there, and then kind of figuring out, where different people come from and who can help you and who can't and all this kind of thing. But then that whole imaginary that he has developed from his writing about the Urals and St. Petersburg falls apart in the Pale Settlement, and it just ends up as a reproduction of these anti-Semitic stereotypes.
That was great. Actually, maybe can I, wait for some other questions to come in. Do you have a question? Or can I actually ask like a follow-on question quickly? Yeah. I was curious, like, it is, when you're saying like the factory serfs and all, so do you think it's, I'm just trying to think, was his genre, his style, was it he himself? Was it being in Russia at the empire at that time? Was there kind of, and this may be out of your scope, but was there cross-border movement of like literary people, that he was kind of appropriating from elsewhere, maybe in Europe? I'm just curious, because it really is a unique perspective, it seems like.
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination of, the style of writing that he's doing is very kind of popular at this time. It's like literature that's in the style of ethnographic sketches. So the novel, Where Is It Better, one could think of as a kind of long collection of ethnographic sketches that turns into a narrative, but one that is like, these characters are working here, then they move and they work here, and then they move and they work here, and this is what happens on the way there, right? Like, so each section of it is narrating this kind of system of that exists in like the gold mines and the salt mines and on the railroad and all of these different labor contexts, so that it's this novel that is constructed of ethnographic sketches. And that was really popular in this period because there was just a real interest in, especially in the wake of the emancipation of the serfs, to have literature be giving a sense of a kind of picture of what is actually going on amongst these people. I think the reason that you find a different picture in Reshetnikov's work does just have to do with where he was from and what he saw. That he, even among that group of writers that was on that slide, he had a little bit of a different background. Like, he wasn't from the priesthood. He spent some time kind of in exile for complicated but interesting reasons as a teenager in like more rural Perm, where he met all these Komi people. It was in one of the places where most of the Komi live. And that area had these big mining factory factories that were serf factories. And then in St. Petersburg, he was poor in a way that meant that he interfaced with the same kinds of systems that people who were peasants coming from the provinces into the city interfaced with. So, things like having his daughter end up in a orphanage, not really an orphanage, like a place for people who can't support their children for a temporary period of time because he's working and his wife is sick. And, so this kind of potential dissolution of the family was something that he was dealing with. And he was dealing with the institutions that you deal with when you are having those problems. And so he learned about them, and his wife worked as a midwife, so he knew about what that work was. He just had this kind of access to these life worlds that I think very few writers from this period who were published and read had.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So we had a question from the audience.
So it seems like, to a certain extent, Reshetnikov is a postmodern ahead of his time, where he's very tuned into senses of alienation, displacement, and identity formed outside the state. to what extent do you think his works, haven't kind of come to us because of the time that he was living in? Like, he was kind of on the wrong side of particularism during the Imperial Russian era, and then he also has kind of a, negative take on proletarian life that doesn't align with the Soviets. Mm-hmm. So do you think, there's a potential revival for him in the future, and that he just hasn't come to us because it wasn't the right timing, or was he just not, that great of a period writer?
I really hope that there can be a revival of interest in Reshetnikov. I mean, I do think that he's a really uniquely, I'm working on this group of writers, and within that group of writers, I do find Reshetnikov to be kind of the most intriguing. There's a Boris Gasparov wrote a essay of some time ago comparing Reshetnikov and Platonov, and basically arguing that they, as both writers who were self-educated and were writing in the sketch tradition, that there are a lot of remarkable commonalities between their works. Not that Reshetnikov is an influence on Platonov, but that they are really similar. And Platonov, has become one of the masters of Soviet literature. So I think there's potential, for Reshetnikov to be of interest in a similar way. I think in the U.S., at least, it just means that his work needs to be translated. I think, where is it better? It could be translated and it could be taught. And that would be great. I would love to do that someday.
Great. Other questions, either from our online audience or in-person audience? Yes.
Well, honestly, just hoping to piggyback off of that question, to the extent of how you've analyzed Reshetnikov and also some of these other authors that you've looked at, how well read are they in Russia? How much has their writing informed modern day Russia and their understanding of the periods that they were writing about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting, on the one hand, they're kind of canonical in the sense that they were among the writers that were republished in the Soviet period. So there's, you can buy a 1986 edition of Reshetnikov's collected works or something. Selected works, not collected works. And I think, and their works are taught in schools to some extent, in universities if you're doing a literature degree. Their names would be known if you were studying 19th century literature at college. There are certainly many much less well-known writers than these writers. And their work has been kind of interest at different moments. So in the 20s and 30s, I think there was a lot more interest in their work than there was a little bit later in the Soviet period, and now they're mostly, just people like me are reading them. But the Nikolai Chuzhak, who was a avant-garde theorist writing for Novidiev, wrote an essay about where he describes basically two branches of Russian literature that he says break off with Reshetnikov. Reshetnikov breaks off Russian literature from the Turgenevian strain and creates the Rasnachinsky strain that goes through Gleb Uspensky and Nekrasov into Mayakovsky, and the literature effect, of course, which is what Nikolai Chuzhak is writing about, while the other strain is what the literature effect is trying to battle against. And scholars were more interested in their works in the 30s as well, I think, because their kind of status as writers from the people, as these proletarian writers, was made them interesting in that period, whereas a little bit later, I think just the canon comes back in a different way, and people stop being interested in writing about Reshetnikov and Nevitov. All of the really useful, like complete collected works of these writers that have like documents and all of the kind of details that you want from those kinds of editions were put out in the 30s. And then it seems like that kind of scholarly attention was not paid to them anymore after that.
Yes, yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about that slide that you had about the Komi workers where they're in jail.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that line, it says, они даже струсили, уж не на тот ли свет они забрались. So aren't they, and that literally means aren't they like in the afterlife, basically?
Yeah.
So is this like, so is the story kind of suggesting that Burlachista is a form of hell? Is this like a religiously inspired tale? Like what's the religious component there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking about that as well. And I mean, so part of it is that these characters have just, their kind of understanding of the difference between life and death is not entirely as concrete as it would be for a different type of character. So I think there's a conflation of hell and burlachestva, and that relates to their general worldview as it's articulated in this story. There's a whole episode where the daughter of this character, Pila, has died, they thought, and then they bury her, and then they hear her scratching at her grave, and they're like, what is going, and they have this whole kind of trying to figure out whether it's a ghost or they really buried her, and they just run away. So they're kind of struggling with the difference between life and death. But part of that is that for these characters, for a lot of the characters in these stories, just it's like what I was saying about the ending of Where Is It Better, that everyone is just about to die. I mean, that's basically how they live, you know. So and in Where Is It Better, it's like, you know, characters are constantly just dropping dead. It's very, very foreboding whenever anyone says that their throat starts to hurt, because they're probably going to be dead in 48 hours. And I think that is responding to reality, you know? And so I think that's, so in this, but because these characters are, and this is also attached to their, the fact that they're Komi, they're Permiak, as they are called, and that they have this kind of pre-modern worldview. So once they leave their home village, they just don't really know what's everything is very confusing and strange, and so it's unclear, yeah. Did we die? Or are we on the barges, or what? Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we are at time. Thank you for excellent presentation, excellent questions from both the in-person and online audience. So we look forward to seeing everyone again soon at our next talk. Thank you.
Thank you.